Well, good morning. How's everybody doing? Is everybody excited and ready to study some Revelation? You're supposed to say yes. All right. Well, if I hadn't met you, I'm Lee Hicks, and I'll be teaching this morning on historicism. If you're like me, that was a topic I was not terribly familiar with. And perhaps the reason for that is that there are not that many who ascribe to it nowadays. The Seventh-day Adventist Church does. It is official doctrine for their church, for their denomination. There are certainly a number of scholars who do, but by and large, most of the evangelical world does not. But what's interesting about historicism is that it was the dominant view of eschatology, of end times, from about 1100 AD until the 800s. Pretty long period of time, pretty long stretch. And that would include, obviously, the Protestant Reformation. So most of the Protestant reformers embrace this view. So it is certainly worth our time and attention to look at, to understand it. And it gives us a perspective on it that's a little different from what most of us today believe. So what is it? Let's start off with a definition. Historicism is the progressive and continuous fulfillment of prophecy in unbroken sequence from Daniel's day and the time of John on down to the second advent in the end of the age. Let me say that again. Let it sink in a little bit. The progressive and continuous fulfillment of prophecy in unbroken sequence from Daniel's day and the time of John on down to the second advent, the second coming of Christ, and the end of the age. So where does the idea come from? Historicists will say this. First, they point to Matthew 24, and we've talked about that a number of times throughout the semester. That's the Olivet Discourse. And there in that passage, we won't take the time to look at it, but if you have the time and you're interested, look at it this afternoon or later. Jesus actually specifically refers there to Daniel's prophecy by name, and he applies it to the events concerning the fall of Jerusalem. 2 Thessalonians 2, there Paul references, or at least alludes to, Daniel chapter 8 and chapter 11, and his prophecy there on the oppressor and the deceiver, and applies it to the church age in the temple of God. So basically, the historicists say this has a foundation in the New Testament in terms of how the New Testament writers, including, well, not a writer, but Jesus himself, applied the prophecies of the Old Testament to their own day. In fact, from some of the doctrinal statements of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they say this: historicism as a method of interpretation is found in the Bible itself, and it provides the key for the interpretation of the apocalyptic books of Daniel and Revelation. So basically, if it's good enough for Jesus, good enough for Paul, it's good enough for us. That is their viewpoint. So what does it consist of? What is sort of a broad view of it? Let me read this quote. They usually teach, they being the historicists, that the sixth seal, the six trumpets, and the seven bold judgments are cyclical of seven major judgments throughout the history of the church. Generally, they believe that we are awaiting the breaking of the seventh seal, which will complete the judgments of Revelation, i.e. the tribulation, lead to the events of Armageddon, and then the second coming. Thus, according to historicism, the time of the tribulation is equated with what has thus far been 2,000 years of church history, with only Armageddon and the second coming still in the future. So essentially, we stand here today, and Revelation has already been fulfilled in large part throughout history, throughout 2,000 years of history, all the way to our current day, and we stand awaiting just the final events of the tribulation, the second coming, in the 1,000-year reign. Presuppositions of historicism. talk a minute about that. The literary sequence, that is the literary progression of Daniel and Revelation especially, equates or equals the chronological sequence of history. Literary sequence equals chronological sequence. That is, if we look through John's visions in Revelation as they unfold there, those match up or line up with historical events. That is the first presupposition. The second, and this seems obvious now that we're at this point, but the second presupposition is that John's visions symbolize actual, real, historic events. So visions equal history. That makes sense? Everybody with me? Any questions to this point? And again, like I started by saying, this was the dominant view of the church from about 1100 through about the 1800s. And that includes some people that we have a great deal of respect for, like Martin Luther and John Calvin, other reformers. Now, where did all this start? There's a man named, and I have no idea if I'm pronouncing this right, but I'm going to guess that maybe you all don't either. So if I'm wrong, you can just keep it to yourself. Joachim of Fiore. Okay? He was an Italian church father in the 1100s. In fact, his dates are 1135 to 1202. And so he goes to the Holy Land during one of the pilgrimages and has a vision or an epiphany. And he develops what he calls a Trinitarian view of history. Now, just to set the stage a little bit, he is well regarded, well respected, has tremendous influence. He's known as a great theologian and a great leader of the church. He's also well respected for his piety, his holiness. So when he starts espousing these views, they have a lot of impact. And up until this day, the church is by and large still in the age, if you will, of Augustine. All right, so backing up about 700 years, Augustine basically puts forward what we would call a amillennial view of end times. All right, and so that's sort of, we're rocking along for several hundred years until we get to this point and things drastically change. So his Trinitarian view of history is basically this. The Old Testament, up until the time of Christ, was the age of the Father, and that represented 42 generations. And beginning with the birth of Jesus, we were ushered into the age of the Son. Again, that was about 42 generations. And then, according to Joachim, however you say it, we will begin the age of the Holy Spirit in 1260 AD. And the age of the Spirit would usher in a utopian area of Christendom. An angelic pope would arise. He would root out the corruption of the church, and all things would be well. Now, where did the 1260 come from? Those numbers you might remember from 11:3, Revelation 11:3 and 12:6. The 1260 days referenced there, he took to mean 1260 years. And so, about the time, not too long after his death, he believed that this new age of the Holy Spirit would be introduced. He also went back in time and sort of recast all of history up until that point in terms of Revelation. So he identified each of the 7 bowls, each of the 7 seals, each of the trumpets, and he tied them to historic events. So, for example, in 1187, there was an Islamic warrior, General Saladin, who attacked and captured Israel, and he believed that he represented the sixth head of the seven-headed dragon of Revelation 12. And so what that means was, or meant at that time for him, is that the seventh head was just on the horizon and he would be the Antichrist. And we'd be at the tribulation, and then soon after, we would be at the millennial reign. He had a tremendous amount of influence, as I said. He was an advisor to popes. He even met with Richard the Lionheart on his way to the Third Crusade. He wintered in Sicily, in Italy, and the two met there. And no one really knows for sure what they talked about, but many believe that Richard was convinced that he was part of this, and he was going to bring about what would eventually become Armageddon. So those views take root in the church and end up having tremendous effect. So fast forward to the Protestant Reformation. So we're in the 1500s. And many of the Protestant reformers really just assume this. They're focused on justification. They're focused on the five solas. They're focused on everything, a lot of other things. This is probably not one of them, but it is assumed in their writings and their teaching and their thinkings. Historicism is just sort of in the ether, and it's what they believe. Some of them sort of adapt it and develop it further and bring up this sort of recast of history in terms of Revelation to their day. And you may have seen it. Many of them, in fact, almost all of them, will refer to the Pope as the Antichrist. Now, of course, they didn't like the Pope, and they strongly disagreed with his theology, but there's another reason for that, and that was their historicism. They truly believed that Revelation was unfolding into their day, that we were right there at the seven-headed dragon, and the Pope was it. John Knox certainly believed this. He even referred to the Roman Catholic Church as the whore of Babylon. They didn't mince words back then. Pretty blunt. And this is part of the reason. It fit into their historicism. So, now there are some exceptions. And one of them is Luther. And he always throws you for a loop for things like this, you know. He actually questioned whether Revelation should be in the canon itself in some writings, sort of like he did with James, okay? But in other writings, he seems to assume this view, and he adopts the language about the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church that the other reformers do. Calvin himself also assumed it, wrote consistent with it, but interestingly, he wrote a commentary on every book of the Bible except for three, one of which was Revelation. And he called it the sacred ground on which he did not want to tread. He just was a little nervous about going there. But it was certainly part of his theology overall. Let's spend a little bit of time coming forward in time on Jonathan Edwards. And of course, he was an American. He's living in the early 1700s. Many view him as perhaps the greatest theologian and philosopher in American history. Just a brilliant guy, and I kind of hate to dwell on this part of his thinking. Because in our day, in our ears, it sounds just a little bit off. But he fully embraced historicism. He wrote that the Roman Catholic Church was the whore of Babylon, the Pope was the Antichrist. And he specifically believed that in his day, he was living at the time between the 6th and 7th bowls. Now you remember, especially in the 1740s, the Jacobites were rebelling in Scotland. The French had declared war on England. Rebellion was brewing in America. And a great revival had taken root in early America. And he saw that and that as the onset of what would lead up to Armageddon in the millennial reign of Christ. Now, he was very cautious. I mean, he was a very careful thinker. He didn't think, well, the millennial reign of Christ will start here in America or Europe, but he was sort of cautiously optimistic that that's what was happening. And he had obviously a tremendous influence in early America. So, what happened? What happened to this view? Well, there's really two answers to that. It was wedded pretty closely with postmillennialism. If you were a historicist, you also, by and large, believe postmillennialism. And basically, that's the idea that the church would grow and expand, its influence would reach all corners of the world, the reign of Christ would grow, the church would grow, the sort of glorious age, Christ would come back after that 1,000 years. Well, as Steve has mentioned several times this semester, as we get further along in history and turn the century from the 1800s to the 1900s, the World Wars put an end to that. It's hard to believe that history is progressing, that things are getting better when we have these two just horrific world wars. But there's another thing that happens to historicism, and it takes us back a little further in time. There was a man named William Miller. He's alive in the early 1800s, and he has a powerful influence. He's here in America, and he develops this historicism and sort of brings it up to his day. And he concludes, based on, and we won't get into all the details of it, but based on some prophecies in Daniel, Ezekiel, and Revelation, that Jesus would come back in October of 1844. And I believe it was the 12th or the 13th. I mean, it was a specific day. And many, many people throughout the church believe this. This is, roughly about the time of the Second Great Awakening in America. It's tremendous interest in Christianity, and he has a powerful effect. And he's obviously wrong. And many, many people know it. And so historicism pretty much dies as a dominant view of end times. And it, in fact, gives birth to views that we're more familiar with today: dispensationalism, premillennialism. Now, there's still many that would hold on to it, kind of modify things after Miller, but that had a big effect, a big impact. All right, what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses of historicism? And that's not rhetorical. If anybody wants to throw some out. What do you think? What are some of the strengths of it? Anybody? What about it has sounded like, yeah, that makes some sense? Or does any of it? You only have weaknesses. All right. What's a weakness then? We can go there.
Well, I think it's really obvious, and this surely struggled with this, but you can see as you unfold this that Revelation typically becomes, for us, our interpretive lens for that becomes whoever is our perceived enemy of the day. Right? So there's very few people that today are thinking that the Pope is the Antichrist and that the Roman Catholic Church is the great enemy of the world. But what I do hear a lot of is that now weakness of it then would be that it's very time bound to the audience of the day, right?
Okay.
So again, those things like the Roman Catholic Church doesn't exist to the first century audience of Revelations, right? So it continues to just be like this book is written to me right now in this time.
Okay. Very good. Very good. I think that's exactly right. It's subjective. Ron here could sit down this afternoon and write out a history of the world and tie it to different events in Revelation. And the pandemic of 2020 could be the sixth bowl. You know, in 3 generations from now, Ron's great-great-grandson could sit down and say, he got that wrong, because we've had a worse pandemic since then, and that was the sixth bowl. You know, it is subjective. There's not much in terms of objective criteria to guide it and to judge it. And it is certainly time-bound. All right, what else? Weakness or strength. Now, this was the view of the church for 800 years, so it's got to have some strengths. Okay, we're not all of a sudden just a lot smarter. It has to have some validity. Any other weaknesses or strengths? All right, well, I'll talk about strengths for a minute. It certainly takes the visions of John seriously. It takes prophecy seriously. You know, unlike idealism, which sort of sees it all as just a struggle of good and evil, it makes Revelation relevant. It would say that preterism has made prophecy irrelevant. Because remember, preterism basically says, at least in some variations, that all the prophecies of John have already happened back in 70 AD. Of course, Revelation is still relevant for a preterist, but it's more in terms of its principles. But the historicists would say, yeah, that the principles are relevant, but also the prophecies are very relevant. It links prophecy closely with history, and it is trying to follow a pattern that it sees in the New Testament in terms of how the New Testament is applying Old Testament prophecy. Okay? And I think there's an argument. There's a counter to that, and maybe we'll talk about that later on, but that is certainly worth looking at, thinking about. Any other weaknesses? Think about the presuppositions that we talked about earlier. Do you think those hold? And let's remember those presuppositions, that the literary sequence in John's visions reflect the chronological sequence. Does that make sense? Is that happening? And you know, you kind of have to think through the details, but you can poke a couple holes in that. For example, Revelation 12, John has a vision of the woman of the apocalypse who gives birth to the Messiah. Clearly a reference to Jesus in his birth. But this is in chapter 12, and it's going back many, many years. It doesn't seem to be in sequence with historical chronology. Another example, the seal number 6. There's a cosmic earthquake, and the sun and the moon and the stars, all the heavenly lights fall. But in trumpet 4, the sun, the moon, and the stars are still in the sky. All right, and that's after. So there's not really a sequence there that seems to tie with chronology. And preterists would say that in John's visions, there's some overlapping. There's some recapitulation, meaning he's seeing some of the same events maybe from a different perspective, from a different vision. And they're not all in a chronological sequence. Does that make sense?
I think also it's, and every single position struggles with this in some form, but the ideal of taking things literally always breaks down at some point. So in the view of historicism, they might say, well, we take all the numbers literally, right? We're gonna try to figure out the exact time periods based on this number of days, this many
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that we all struggle with what's literal in the sense what ties to a historical event versus what is spiritual. Okay. Yeah, that is definitely an issue that runs throughout. Any other thoughts, questions about historicism? Yes, sir.
Well, just the obvious one, Mark 13 and 30s talking about we won't know when the time will come. We don't know the day. We don't know. Be alert, be on guard, but we don't know.
Right. Very good. Yeah, absolutely. We have to have some humility here. I mean, I have a view about all this, but I hold it pretty loosely in the sense that I know I could be wrong. I think about the first century Jews who were looking back at prophecy about what the Messiah would look like, and almost all of them got it wrong. And if I had been living then, I probably would have too. So we have to have some humility about this. I watched a video by Bruce Gore about his teaching on historicism to help me get ready, and he makes this point at the end, and I want to end with this because I think it really helps. It really helped me, and maybe it'll help you. But in Revelation 5, we have John's vision of the scroll that's sealed. You remember the 7 seals. And the question goes out, who is worthy? Who's worthy to break the seals and open the scroll? And John cries. He cries out because there's no one worthy. But then a voice tells him that there is someone worthy, and it's Jesus Christ. No one can look at it but him. No one can break those seals but him. No one can open that scroll but him. Our history, our future is hidden without him, without his help. We cannot make sense of history or even of ourselves without him, the one who is worthy to open that seal. We can't understand what life is about on a very basic level without him who can open that scroll. So think of that. I know there's a lot of nuance here, a lot of difficulty. It is a struggle. And not next week, but 2 weeks from today, we're going to hear about dispensationalism from Alan. So we'll get that viewpoint also. And that will get us into premillennialism and those debates. But ultimately, remember that we know the one who can make sense of our history and our future and our time. And thankfully for us, he is the one who holds it all and will come back as that true and good judge. So, with that said, let's end there and let me close this in prayer. Our Father, thank you so much for this time to study your word together. Thank you for the scriptures and revelation, for the visions. And we thank you that Jesus Christ is the one who can open the scroll, who is worthy to make sense of our history, to make sense of our future. And we know we ourselves can't do it. We're not worthy, and we can't make sense of it. But we trust in the one who can, and we look to him and just pray that you would guide this church and grow it, and that we would all become more faithful followers of Jesus Christ. And pray this in his name. Amen.